Vinieron los mercenarios por el único camino, la ensenada de cochinos extraordinarios. Por allí vinieron, pero allí quedaron. Por allí vinieron los pobres, pero allí quedaron.
Olá, sejam bem-vindos e bem-vindas a mais este evento do 6º Salão do Livro Político, que ocorre de 24 de setembro a 3 de outubro de 2021. Eu sou Haroldo Cerávulo Cereza, um dos organizadores do Salão. Com o tema Livros que Gritam, o Salão do Livro Político conta com a participação de 68 editoras independentes e é uma realização das editoras Boitempo, Autonomia Literária, Anita Garibaldi e Alameda, e também da PUC São Paulo. Cursos, mesas redondas e entrevistas com autores fundamentais na defesa de uma sociedade mais justa fazem parte da nossa programação. Ela está disponível no endereço salãodolivropolitico.com.br. Também neste endereço, você encontra a lista das editoras participantes e uma seleção de títulos com descontos de 20% a 50%. São livros que gritam por democracia e justiça social, contra o fascismo e a ultradireita. Os descontos estão nos sites da própria editora, das editoras participantes, já atribuídos no valor dos livros ou através de um cupom com o nome VI Salau, 6º Salão, tudo em letra maiúscula. Esperamos que vocês gostem do debate. Se inscrevam no canal do Salão no YouTube e difundam livros e vídeos para o mundo melhor. As entrevistas do Salão foram gravadas para que a gente pudesse legendá-las antes delas irem ao ar. As mesas redondas e os cursos são ao vivo. Até mais, espero que vocês gostem do evento que começa agora. Obrigado.
So, we are here with Professor Alex Vitale. How is how you can pronounce your name? Alex Vitale.
Either Vitale or Vitale.
Vitale, with Professor Alex Vitale. In Brazilian Portuguese, we'll call you Alex Vitale.
Okay.
That will how people will say our name in Brazilian Portuguese.
Yeah, very good.
He's the author of The End of Policing, that is being released in Brazil as O Fim do Policiamento, by Autonomia Literária. I am Amauri Gonzo from Ponte Jornalismo. I'm the editor of Ponte, and we're here today to discuss about the concepts of the book and talk a little bit about how we can deal with the increase of policy in Brazil and also in US. So first things first, Professor, thank you so much for sparing a bit of your time to talk with us. I'd like to ask you first, head on, like, why writing a book about policing? Because one of the nicest things of the book is that we can see that there are a lot of, not the much that we need, but there are a lot of research about policing, especially in the US. What made you say, okay, we need a book where you can like get together all this research from a lot of different people and try to understand how is it going about security and policy in the U.S.
So I've been working on policing issues for 30 years now in a variety of capacities over the last 2 decades, specifically as a police scholar, and have, had published in a number of the leading policing journals and attended all the conferences and spent time with police around the world on patrol, advising them, writing reports, etc. And I've felt that, the policing literature was not taking seriously this emerging discourse around abolition, especially in relationship to incarceration. So there was this growing literature in the period about 10 years ago, really begins to ramp up, that is taking on mass incarceration. And some of that literature is explicitly abolitionist. But I felt that no one was really articulating that argument in relationship to policing. And there wasn't a lot of interest in policing when I started this project. I had the original deal to write this book before the events in Ferguson took place. And I really thought I was going to be talking to a kind of limited community of scholars and activists. Obviously, it's turned into much more than that, as the larger social movements have also moved beyond just a critique of prisons and have more directly engaged these questions of the ultimate utility of policing and what we could be doing differently.
Perfect. That's very important. The book was pretty important in helping people to think about it, and the movement has grown since the releasing of the book and since the writing of the book, right?
The book was very well received when it first came out, in 2018, but in late 2017. So I was already getting a lot of invitations to meet with folks who were doing organizing, and also to discuss these ideas with other academics and policy folks. And so I knew that there was this movement that was emerging across the country. There'd always been a few people doing this work, but it was really expanding. And by the time George Floyd was killed in Minneapolis, and we saw this explosion of protest, it wasn't really a surprise to me that the main demand of that movement was not, more body cameras or, throw a couple of cops in jail, but instead to shift funding out of policing and to take those functions up in other ways. And so that movement got a big boost summer last year, but it's continuing to build and to continue this kind of local organizing around budget priorities.
Perfect, Alex. So let's talk a bit about the concepts. Was the police created to fight crime? What is the real function of police nowadays?
Well, what do we mean by crime might be the first place to start. So my argument is that police are not so much created to fight crime, although that can be a byproduct of what they do. Their primary role is to produce a certain kind of social order maintenance, or order production. And they do that through the management of resistance to systems of exploitation. So what we call crime are those behaviors that threaten existing social relations. And those relations are at core deeply unequal. So what we see is, in the period about 200 years ago, around the world, modern policing is developed in relationship to the three primary mechanisms of exploitation and inequality at that time, which were colonialism, slavery, and mass industrialization. So whether it's the formation of the London Metropolitan Police in 1829, based on a model that was developed during the occupation of Ireland, or the creation of the first state police force in Pennsylvania to manage strikes in the coal and iron fields, which was modeled on the U.S. occupation of the Philippines, or the evolution of Southern police forces from slave patrols and the management of Jim Crow, we see that policing is primarily tasked with dealing with resistance and labeling that resistance crime. whether it's property theft, whether it's disorderly and disruptive behavior, whether it's interpersonal violence, if we understand those behaviors as emerging out of those systems of exploitation, then policing comes on the scene to address those problems through criminalization in ways that don't challenge those systems of exploitation.
Perfect, Professor. And you talk about the concept of over policing. What does it mean? What do you mean what we're talking about when we're talking about over policing?
Well, that's a good question, which is a little difficult to answer because it begs the issue of like, well, what is the right amount of policing? And so this moment that we're having right now is really trying to figure out how we can reduce our reliance on policing in as many ways as possible. Now, one of the counter narratives that's emerged is this idea, well, the problem that many communities face is one of over policing and under policing at the same time. And what that refers to is this idea that the police are spending too much time engaging in harassment and petty law enforcement when they should be focusing on serious crime, on solving real problems of violence. Now, it turns out that that equation doesn't really make any sense when we look at it more carefully. And what we've done is that reinforces this idea that, well, if policing were just done correctly, it would solve all our problems. But what we see is that even when we tell police to just focus on serious crime, drug gangs, interpersonal shootings, the way they address those problems is through high levels of harassment and low-level enforcement and intervention into people's lives. They make a lot of street stops looking for guns. They make a lot of low-level arrests hoping to press people for information. And so it's not really possible to find this perfect balance of under-policing and over-policing, in my view. And another reason this is true is because when we tell the police that they are the mechanism for addressing problems like violence and drug gangs, it is a recipe for escalation because that kind of policing ultimately does not work very well. And this leads to frustration among police and an escalation of tactics and rhetoric. And that's why invariably this kind of policing leads to abuse and corruption. And the solution to that is not to find this imaginary middle, it's to address our problems in other ways, to look at the legalization of drugs, to take the violence out of it, to look at the poverty that is driving interpersonal violence, to create community-based solutions that empower people, that try to heal people, instead of constantly criminalizing them, tearing them down, harassing them, and unfortunately killing them.
Perfect. Talking about communities, do you think that community police or policing with the community is something achievable?
No, I'm really skeptical about this. Community policing is primarily a discourse. It's not really a comprehensive or clear practice. It's an idea that gets brought out whenever policing is facing a legitimacy crisis. So whenever there is resistance to policing, whenever there are uprisings, protests, riots, all of a sudden the solution is not to get the police out of our lives and to heal our communities. No, the solution is community policing. But when we look carefully at the enactment of community policing, we see that it is either completely superficial and meaningless, just a public relations stunt, or it's actually an extension of policing into our lives. It's used to collect information on people, but more importantly, it's there to establish a logic that says that The way we solve community problems is through policing. But that is in essence the problem, because what tools do police have ultimately to solve our community problems? Guns, tickets, handcuffs, violence. These are not the tools our communities need to solve their problems. They need access to real jobs, stable housing, adequate health care, and policing can't provide any of those things to our communities.
Perfect. Thank you so much. I think we're very in the same level of opinion about all this. It's very good to talk with, having the same experience with other people who are researching policing their own ground. So I want to talk a bit about Brazil and to ask about some things that we can learn about United States, because like now we have like policing management of schools in Brazil. There is this idea that you need to, because of Bolsonaro, of course, you need to militarize, and we have a militarized police. We have a police that is really militarized. It uses the same structure, and it works in the same way as the military works. And they say that Bolsonaro and his people says that we need that to create discipline on youth. So the police is not only getting into the school and being around school, but are administrating schools in a very militarized way. And I'd like to ask you about how's the experience of having police in schools in the U.S.?
So interestingly, school policing emerged in somewhat similar ways in the United States. It was a response to a broad crisis of both youth and public support for education. And so what happened is that over a number of decades, there was a reduction in support for education at the same time that many vulnerable communities were experiencing higher levels of poverty, violence, family breakdown, etc. And so this contributed to, some increase in disorder and even violence in schools. And the solution that was developed to this was not to restore after-school programs, hire more counselors, create family supports. The solution was to label those young people as morally deficient, out of control, super predators who would only respond to violence, coercion, and threats. And the goal became not to help those young people achieve academic success, to complete their educations. The goal became, how do we get them out of the educational environment so that we can help the other kids? And so not only were police introduced into the schools, but whole new school systems were created to manage those young people that were removed from the school system, so that they create basically school jails. And then interestingly, this is the same period that the same people who want to cut the school budget and bring the police in say, now we're going to measure the success of education through a series of high stakes testing regimes using quantitative measures of a very narrow set of skills. And we're going to decide how much funding teachers and schools get based on their performance on these tests. Now the school has an incentive to drive out low-performing students, and then those students are put in schools that aren't included in the testing regime. So states like Texas and Florida claim, oh, we fixed our schools while cutting the budget because, look, our test scores went up once we started focusing on testing. But what they never explained was that they took 20% of the lowest performing students and excluded them from the testing regimes and basically threw those young people away. their lives are ruined. They end up in the adult criminal justice system, unemployed, homeless, etc. And this is what's labeled a success.
So it's not a good path, okay? It's not. Let's try not to do that in Brazil also. So United States and Brazil has this strong ties with the past of shadow slavery, especially of black people that were kidnapped from Africa. And just as United States, Brazil also has a high murder rate by the police. Actually, way bigger. One thing that I was thinking reading your book is that how American police doesn't kill so much. I thought that they would be killing more because it's easy for them, just as it's easy for our police down here in Brazil. But do you think that the past, this complicated past of slavery, of lack of reparations, has some influence in how police are so violent in our continent?
Yes, I think we have to understand these three factors, right, that lead to the production of modern policing. It's not just slavery for either the US or Brazil, it's also colonialism. So early police forces in the US and Brazil play a role in driving out indigenous populations, stealing their land and their resources, and suppressing their resistance. And also, policing in both the US and the Brazil emerges to manage workers' resistance to regimes of industrial exploitation and also agricultural labor exploitation. And so we see policing used to put down strikes, to disappear labor leaders, to break up meetings, to prevent the formation of worker power. And so these are the forming legacies of policing that continue to inform the basic function and nature of the institution. And then when policing proves to be deeply racially discriminatory and produce these racially discriminatory outcomes, we're told, oh, well, we're going to give the police some implicit bias training and we're going to hire a few black police officers and this will fix the problem. And this is a way of erasing this entire history and nature of the institution. And invariably, these superficial PR efforts are completely unsuccessful in changing policing in any meaningful way.
Perfect. My next question was kind of about this. In Brazil, we tried to have some reforms on the police. We had like in the 90s, police, the crimes of the military police, which is the bulk of the force in Brazil, controlled by the states, not by the municipalities. They're all militarized. Most of the only the investigative police is called civilian police in Brazil. Only the detectives and this kind of people. Most of the what they call ostensive policing, exactly. The ostensive policing, the patrol policing is militarized. And until the 90s, they had a special court, a military.
Local police give out like traffic tickets and that sort of thing.
Local police traffic tickets and stop and frisking black kids. That's right. Just their main role in our society. But in the 90s, they had this special court, the military court, just as everyone else in the military. And then we changed that for a jury court. When cases, we don't have jury for anything, just as you have in US. We have just as on what we call crimes against life. So in case of murder, and now they're responding to a jury. But on the other hand, responding to a jury didn't stop them of killing people, because the juries are very lenient to police because of media, because of how the lawyers will frame them as like everybody in big distress. And now nothing happened that was like really good. And now we're talking, a lot of states are talking about having body cameras on police officers. With this experience of US, how do you think that we can manage to have that in Brazil? Do you think we can have some success with this body camera thing right now?
No. But I'll say a bit more, which is that, look, at the very best, body cameras can only possibly be as successful as the mechanisms of accountability can make them. So in other words, just because there's footage does not change the reluctance of prosecutors, the reluctance of judges, the reluctance of juries, or the legal frameworks that police operate in that are all incredibly permissive of police use of violence. So if we don't change these larger systems of accountability, the introduction of video evidence is unlikely to make any real difference. This is what we've seen in the US. We've seen a very small number of outrageous cases result in some, different outcomes possibly. But overall, when we do more controlled studies, we find that the body cameras have no meaningful effect on policing because the police know that nothing is going to happen to them regardless of what the footage shows.
Perfect. It's good to hear that because there are a lot of people in Brazil who are very excited about body cams and think they're like flatten. The first month here in São Paulo, they're beginning to experiment with that, and there was a lower rate of police murders, but it was like pretty high last year, like really high. Like only in São Paulo, I think it was 400 people killed by the police in the month of April. I need to check that. I'll bring it later. But on the other hand, how can we? Of course, the street violence is not as complex in US as it is in Brazil or Mexico and other countries in Latin America. How can we talk about having less police in that kind of environment? Because it's complicated for politicians to come out and say, yeah, we want to defund the police in Brazil, because everybody will think, yeah, but like all these thugs with guns around, who's gonna fight them?
Well, how's that working for you now? I mean, it's not like this massive mobilization of militarized policing has done anything to reduce the availability and use of guns, to diminish the power and influence of organized criminality, has created these wonderful utopian favelas where everyone lives peacefully together, right? So what you're doing is not working. It is leading to mass violations of human rights, the immiseration of entire communities, and is giving help to an ideology of right-wing repression and authoritarianism. So obviously, Brazil has serious problems. These problems are clearly tied to deep problems of inequality. You have huge numbers of people who are completely excluded from the formal economy, from stable housing, from access to basic government services. And this is where almost all of the serious, harmful behavior originates from. And the politicians who have been put in office to keep that system going are the exact same politicians who tell us the solution is ever more intensive militarized policing, because they were put in office to fend off efforts to push back against inequality and exploitation. That's their reason for being in office, is to label the problems of Brazilian society as ones of criminality of immorality, of super predators who commit crime, which can only ever be addressed through repressive policing and mass incarceration. And when that doesn't work, as it invariably does not, that gives rise to calls for even more. And at the extremes, informal death squads, extrajudicial killings, and all the rest, because the police have been told it's all on them. And yet the tools that they use don't work. And so when they fail, they go harder.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Alex. It's very common.
There are sort of red light zones that have been informally decriminalized, so that, but maybe that's in part the result of corruption and payoffs.
It's kind of like that. There are some places where it happens. You have like places where they'll go to work, but these places, although they get the money of them, these are not legal. They have to bribe the cops. But the one of the biggest examples, there are two big examples, but I'll talk about one that I know personally because I went to do some research there. In Campinas, a city, 1 million people city, very from 100 kilometers of São Paulo, they created this red light district in the military dictatorship. The vice police, our own vice police then, we don't have vice police now, but our vice police then created this red light zone near a road because truckers will stop there. And I've been there, I think 5 years ago, to do some research for BBC, and it was actually dominated by drug dealers because they are doing all the stuff. So BBC wanted to go there and film, and we said, you don't have the money to bribe them. You need a lot of money to bribe them to go there and film, because all around are people from the drug. There are a lot of drug dealers around,
Yeah.
and they'll be looking for you. They'll maybe try to kidnap you if you're like being very much around. So it's a very complicated gray zone, and we have big problems in not regulating sex work in its whole extent. We tried to do that, but it didn't go on Congress.
Well, what I say in the book is that we have to look at the models of decriminalization and legalization, and then we have to work with local communities to find the right balance. So for some parts of the industry, simple decriminalization would allow more independent contractors, so to speak, independent operators, would allow some sex workers to group together on their own behalf. But there would still be the threat of organized criminality and even trafficking. And so there needs to be some oversight. But it should be almost treated like a labor rights issue, right? It's not really a crime issue. It's people, just as if there were forced labor in sugarcane fields, right? That should be handled as a labor rights issue. People should have the right to organize, to file a complaint, to have an intervention from the public, the attorney general's office or whatever, the public prosecutor's office, to resolve those problems. But clearly, in either of those models, taking the police as we normally think of them out of the equation is a big plus.
Oh yeah. No, that helps, but that's complicated. Just two last questions for us to finish. How can we talk about having less police when there are poor communities asking for more police? Mm-hmm. What do we need, and how do we need to talk about our own communities, our surroundings, or communities in struggle, about the importance of having less policing?
Right. So there's a couple of ways we need to think about this. First is, communities have real problems. There is violence. There's interpersonal harm. There is property theft. There is disorderly, disruptive, threatening behavior. And communities have a right to demand that those problems be addressed. But policing is not the only possible tool that we can imagine or have seen be effective at addressing those things. But part of the problem is, and this is the second part of the way of thinking about this, is that for generations now, people have been told the only tool they can have to address those community problems is armed police. And so what's required in this moment is community organizing, mobilization that works with communities to unleash all those other ideas that people have about how to make their community a better, safer, healthier place to live in. And it turns out when communities are given an opportunity to ask for what they really want, they have a very long list of very clear demands, and policing ends up being pretty low down on the list. They want decent schools for their kids. They want decent housing for their families. They want stable income so they don't live in desperate poverty, And they have ideas about how to address the violence and the property crimes that they're subjected to. And it's also important to remember that what this movement to reduce policing is calling for is not like flipping some magical switch and tomorrow there are no police and everybody's on their own and it's chaos. It's about a long-term process of developing new infrastructures of safety and health in communities that allow us to dial back our reliance on policing. So no one thinks this is going to happen overnight. No one thinks we have the answer to every single possible, problem in a community. But here's, I think, the way to think about this is that when we call for policing, we typically make three mistakes. First, we grossly overestimate the actual effectiveness of policing in dealing with whatever the problem is. Police are not protecting women. Police are not preventing property crime. Police have not done anything about drug gangs. They are not stopping the violence. Second is that we fail to consider the costs of policing. Policing is hugely expensive financially. When policing is enacted, it produces violence and death and criminalizes entire communities. And it also establishes the legitimacy of an ideology, of a worldview that says the solution to our problems is coercive intervention towards criminals. And in that way, it erases all these larger social questions about why we have the social problems we have. And then third, the third mistake we make is that we fail to consider the alternatives. We have better ways to keep schools safe. We have better ways to address our society's drug problems. We have better ways of managing problems of mental health and substance abuse. We have better ways of addressing organized drug criminality. It's time to unleash those alternatives and to begin a process of dialing back our reliance on policing and the ideology that continues to reward authoritarian politics.
I'll throw a couple more questions on based
Okay.
on what we're talking about.
That's a good closing, though.
No, we can
That was a
edit
good
that,
closing.
right?
Yeah.
But I have the closing question is nice. You
Okay.
like
All
that.
right.
Don't worry. First is we have our own variety of cop shows in Brazil. We have like the ones with like big chases and shit, but you also have like we also have like very common policing who are very. There are a lot of memes about it on all social media, because when you go and see what the police are doing like every day, they're just dealing with like neighbors fighting or some issues of social problems, issues of domestic abuse, and issues of mental health. And although we do have the real evidence, we just laugh at police in Brazil, and the real evidence, like why do we have police working on a mental health case? People are not like don't look at that and say, yeah, why are we throwing armed cops against like people with mental health issues? We don't ask that kind of questions. What's the kind of environment that makes us think about policing first before anything else?
So look, policing has an inherent legitimacy problem. When the history of policing is a history of legitimacy seeking, because huge swaths of the population have deep skepticism about their role in society. They may feel there's no alternative, but they have a deep skepticism. And so there is always a massive apparatus of producing legitimacy for policing, a constant discourse of reform to try to convince people something's being done about the obvious problems that we see. And also the production of media stories that celebrate policing, that place police at the center of all discourses of public safety. And finally, we have a massive infrastructure of propaganda, of dramatic shows, movies, etc., that lionize policing and imagine or portray police as helping us, as saving us. And so when we watch TV, what we see is, police solving these amazing crimes and getting the bad guy every time and dealing out justice, which often is really just revenge. And there's very little space for counter narratives. Writing a television show about a community worker helping young people solve their problems without violence, it doesn't come with all the drama of cops shooting it out with bad guys. So we have to quit relying on those mainstream representations of policing to shape our understandings of the basic function of policing. And we need to rely more on these face-to-face community-based connections with people to establish new logics of care and solidarity, that will lead hopefully to demands to create healthier, safer communities and better life opportunities for people, so that we don't have to have police in our lives, either as exaggerated buffoons that we can make fun of because we have this underlying distrust of them, or as heroes who are going to solve all our problems.
Is HBO's The Wire propaganda? That's a trick question.
It's complicated.
Yeah, it's complicated.
Which is why it's good. Yeah.
Yeah. I loved it. It's my favorite series. But like talking about real issues, you talk a bit about like police who doesn't carry guns, just like in UK, that happens in Japan also. But how can we think about a not gun carrying police in a country like US, where everybody's potentially armed because of the Second Amendment? How can we even think about it? Because there are a lot of guns in US.
Well, of course, one of the reasons there are so many guns in the US is our legacy of policing. That we established policing around these systems of slavery and colonialism that were rooted in armed violence. And policing was a central feature of that armed violence. So maybe if we began to reduce the scope of armed policing, that would be part of how we create a new culture that is less rooted in celebrating armed violence, which American culture is, completely consumed with. Revenge fantasies and shootouts and all the rest. But I think more practically, what I'm talking about is not necessarily going and taking guns away from uniformed police. What I'm interested in is taking functions away from policing and turning them over to civilians. We don't need armed police to take traffic collision reports. We don't need armed police to take burglary reports. We should not have armed police in our schools. We should not be using armed police to manage our society's drug problems. We should not be sending armed police to manage someone having a mental health crisis. So it's about replacing police with people who have the appropriate skill set to address these problems without all that relying on violence. And when we do that, we reduce not just the violence in the community, but the violence that comes from policing. Police produce a huge number of homicides within Brazilian society. They're responsible for between 5 and 10% of all homicides in the United States. And so let's stop the killing by reducing our reliance on policing.
Perfect. So for the last question, is it easier to imagine the end of the world or the end of policing? Can we dream of a world without police?
I'm sorry, I missed the beginning of that. Start
Is it
over.
Is it easier to imagine the end of the world or the end of policing? Can we dream of a world without policing, without police? Can we hope for it, like really, or is it's a future of our society that will never go out?
Well, my friend Ruth Wilson Gilmore says that abolition is about the end of everything, right? It's about changing everything, right? Because when we understand policing as being rooted in the central systems of exploitation in our society, it requires that we begin to dismantle those systems of exploitation and inequality that generate the perceived need for policing. The trick here is that this does not mean that we have to wait until there's some total transformation of society to then figure out what to do about policing. It turns out, in my view, that what we need to do is we need to do these things simultaneously. That part of how we create a new society is to work to dismantle our reliance on policing. In part because policing has always been the central tool that has been used to attack our movements, to prevent the formation of alternative logics, to reduce the exploitation. So we're never going to have broad social transformation if we don't simultaneously push back against policing and the ideology that supports it.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Alex.
That was a lot of perfect. I hope it was good. Good.
No, it was great. I liked the interview very much. I hope everybody who's watching us, if you want to grab, now you have like End of Policy, O Fim do Policiamento, right now at Editora Autonomia Literária. So now we can read about it and discuss that about that in Brazil. Thank you so much for your time, Alex. Hope to see you in Brazil soon for us to discuss it in a more broader aspect and maybe do some research around here, and we can compare some notes about how is it going, the fight against policing in our countries.
I'd like that very much. Obrigado.